Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome. Welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. My name is Fran Rosenfeld, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the museum. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you for joining us for tonight's program, which is a conversation between architecture critic Paul Goldberger and author Kevin Baker, inspired by Paul's new book, Ballpark: Baseball in the American City, which was just published by Knopf this past May. And we're really honored to have them both here tonight. Both writers are great students and raconteurs of baseball and New York history, so I think we're in for a real treat. And as we know, September is the best month for baseball. So it's great we have this conversation. And also, we're thrilled to present this in connection with our current exhibition on the third floor. I don't know if anyone here had a chance to see tonight, if they hadn't before, in the Dugout with Jackie Robinson, an intimate portrait of a baseball legend. This is on our third floor. It's going to be on view for about another 10 days. Exhibition closes on September 22nd. And it traces Jackie Robinson's rise to fame with the Brooklyn Dodgers through the lens of photos published primarily in Look magazine. So I encourage you to come back and visit. We're actually keeping the gallery on the third floor open tonight after the program if you want to pop up there and have a look. But also, other things will be happening after their conversation with Paul and Kevin. They'll both be signing copies of their books in the back of our auditorium, where we'll also have their books for sale. We have representatives of our museum shop here. Paul will, of course, be signing Ballpark, and Kevin will be signing Mr. October, the revealing story of Reggie Jackson and the world champion New York Yankees, which he co-authored with Mr. Jackson, I believe, and another book, which I'll say more about in one second. And the books, as I said, will be for sale at the table next to us. I just want to say that looking ahead, we hope you will return to the museum for an upcoming program we have next month. It's called The Crucible of Creativity with Patti Smith and Anthony Olofsson. That's happening on Wednesday, October 16th at 6:30. And so we have architectural historian Anthony Olofsson sitting down in conversation with his friend and acclaimed writer and artist and performer Patti Smith to talk about his new biography of Frank Lloyd Wright, and more broadly, the past, present, and future of the city as a hotbed for creativity. And you can find out more online, mcny.org/core-convo. Before introducing our speakers, just want to ask you, please turn off anything that buzzes or beeps, but feel free to tweet your hearts away using our hashtag MCNYLive. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Paul Goldberger is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and he began his career at the New York Times, where he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for distinguished criticism for his writing on architecture. And later, and for 15 years, he was architecture critic for The New Yorker. He's the author of many books, including most recently Ballpark, and also, just to name a few, Building Art, The Life and Work of Frank Gehry, Why Architecture Matters, and Building Up and Tearing Down, Reflections on the Age of Architecture. Goldberger teaches at the New School, and he lectures widely around the country on architecture, design, historic preservation, and cities. And he's working currently, I believe, on a full-length biography of Frank Gehry. And Kevin Baker is an award-winning novelist, historian, and journalist whose most recent book, full-length book, is America the Ingenious: How a Nation of Dreamers, Immigrants, and Tinkerers Changed the World. His previous books that have engaged with baseball include Becoming Mr. October, about Reggie Jackson, and also Sometimes You See It Coming, a novel, which is based in part on the life of baseball legend Ty Cobb. And his 5 other novels include Dreamland, Paradise Alley, and The Big Crowd, all works of historical fiction set during various moments in New York's past. In his brand new book, The Fall of a Great American City, New York and the Urban Crisis of Affluence, will be officially published on October 8th, but you can sneak an early copy tonight. It's for sale also in the back. So we feel really lucky at the museum to count both writers as friends of this institution, and so I just ask you, please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Fran. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. It always was a city game, baseball. For all the efforts to slap a pastoral gloss on the sport, for all the attempts to make it about little boys playing in a cow pasture, only someone unfamiliar with the isolation of American farm life could truly believe that baseball came of age in the country. What we think of as baseball today is really an urban game. Baseball is a game that grew up inextricably linked to the pace and the customs and the demands of the American city. It was shaped by the challenges and the possibilities the city had to offer, by its inventiveness and its ambitions, its grandiosity, and even its corruption. For the last 2 centuries, the game's trajectory has followed the city's many rises and declines, its booms and its busts. It gives me great pleasure tonight to talk to you at the museum with Paul Goldberger, one of our foremost writers and observers of architecture and urban design in America. Also, on a personal note, Paul bailed me out a few years ago when I was doing the aforesaid As Told To book with Reggie Jackson. Reggie, as many of you may suspect, is a rather mercurial character. At times it was difficult getting him to open up, but I noticed that people were always calling him and asking him for things. So I resolved never to ask him for anything, but instead to give him something. Fortunately, I had in my bookshelves a volume called Above New York, one of a series of aerial photography books by Robert Cameron, which featured a text by Paul. And one of the sets of pictures in it happened to be a before and after shot of Rockefeller Center, which was roughly the same view Reggie had from his palatial suite high in the old Helmsley Palace Hotel. It was quite a suite. When I first met him there, I said, "Gee, Reg, I can only see 5 or 6 states from here." And he leaned in and said to me quite confidentially, "I hit more home runs than you did." I didn't tell him that so did everybody on the Pigeon Cove Red Sox, my Little League team. Anyway, I gave him that book, and he was absolutely enraptured. He must have read every word of it. So thank you, Paul.
This is the best. Tonight has to go quite far to beat that moment, actually. That's great to know. Thank you.
So as you write, the American ballpark is the essence of Rus in Urba, the country and the city. And it is really a city game. The first places where they charged money to watch men play baseball was in that hotbed of baseball, New York, which was to say, right. Brooklyn.
Absolutely, yes. In fact, as you've just said perfectly, Kevin, the history of baseball is much more an urban history than a rural history. Cooperstown, lovely place that it is nevertheless built on an entirely mythological history. Right. Within the city, Brooklyn was itself almost the real core with, at one point, literally dozens of teams. And what I consider to have been the very first true ballpark was Union Grounds in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War, actually.
And that's when they started charging admission.
That was right, exactly. We have a few images, and let's see if we can show a few. Baseball was popular for a while before that, and one of the most popular places was across the river in Hoboken. This is Elysian Fields, which later became the site of the Maxwell House Coffee Factory, actually. But it was gradually transitioning from being a sport for players to a spectator sport as well. And there was a interesting and entrepreneurial fellow named William Kammerer, who, by the way, since this is the Museum of the City of New York, trivial facts about New York history are never out of place. He was a very good friend of Boss Tweed. But anyway, he owned an ice skating rink, and he was not making enough money from it. Noticed more and more people were going to Elysian Fields just to watch baseball, and he figured maybe there was a possibility of converting his ice skating rink into a ball field during the summer when ice skating is not too big. And he is the first person, so far as I could tell, to have actually put a fence around a ball field and charged money to get in and had some seats. So Union Grounds is, by my reckoning, the beginning of the ballpark.
So there were actually seats there and all, too.
There were some seats, yes. There were not elaborate grandstands,
Right.
but there were seats, there was a fence, and you had to pay money.
And it also led to what became a real tradition in many ballparks, an oddity actually on the field, which I think is visible in the picture here, right? Or-
Yeah, not actually.
not
It's,
quite, yeah.
in the book, it's more visible because the book also has this picture, but also a picture of it as an ice skating rink. When the angle it makes it more visible, there was a pagoda out in the middle of the ice skating rink, which I guess made some sense as a sort of little pavilion that you could skate to or something like that. Kammerer left it there when it became the outfield, actually, and players ran around it or hit around it or whatever.
It's of course, what's an ice skating rink without a pagoda? You know?
Exactly. Well, but it marks in a way the beginning of what I think is a really critical and much more serious point about baseball, which is that while the diamond is very precise and prescribed and identical everywhere, the outfield is not.
Right.
And the outfield can be played around with, generally not in as elaborate a way as having a pagoda in it, but nevertheless, the dimensions of outfields are indefinite and different from ballpark to ballpark.
And this went on for quite a while. Those of you who are old enough can remember the original Yankee Stadium, how they actually had the flagpole and the
Right.
monuments
Right.
on the field, which led a generation of kids to think there were actually Yankees buried out there.
Right,
And
right,
Lou
exactly,
Gehrig was
exactly,
buried
exactly.
in center field.
Right. Now, only their opponents were buried.
Yeah. It's and you mentioned the whole Stevens Ballpark, which was out in Hoboken.
Yes, Elysian Fields,
Yeah.
right.
And
right.
one of its big selling points was that you wouldn't catch yellow fever there.
It was theoretically healthier. Yes, this is the beautiful rustic escape across the Hudson River.
Yeah.
But again, but in fact, it was such a big place for outings
Yeah.
that it became, in fact, a little too carnival-like in the view of many people.
Right.
And there's a great, I don't know how many of you know the famous Diary of New York by George Templeton Strong from the 19th century, but he actually has an entry in his diary about going out to Elysian Fields to see a ball game and being disgusted by men and their strumpets,
Yeah.
was his line, actually, that it was not a classy enough crowd for him.
Yeah, he was disgusted by a lot.
Yeah, he was, right, so not sure that made it all that distinctive.
But they had all kinds of, they had like a toy train out there or something, right?
Well,
And-
one of
yeah.
the fascinating things about researching this book was discovering that the entire history of baseball is one of tension between baseball as entertainment and indeed cooperating with other forms of entertainment in the same venue, and baseball as kind of serious game with a capital S and a capital G that must be treated as a holy act and a sacred act. And in fact, the entire, the growth of the National League and the tension between it and what was called the American Association, but informally known as the Beer and Whiskey League,
Yes.
was very much around that. The Beer and Whiskey League, understandably, allowed beer and whiskey at their games, and the National League not only had a rule against the sale of alcohol. There were obviously no distractions such as vulgar games or other things going on. It also did not permit Sunday games. I think that you were supposed to be in church, not playing
the
baseball.
blue laws and all
Right,
that.
exactly.
You describe it, their competition as amusement versus vice. And that's sort of like what the atmosphere was at these places. And
Yes.
And so the National League games would be places you'd be much more likely to have women and children and be more of a respectable
Well, it was to attract, women and children and a higher grade of people. Ultimately, as it turned, in fact, one of the leaders of the American Association, which did not, by the way, grow into the American League. That was something else altogether. The American Association ultimately failed and was taken over by the National League, but the National League evolved quickly and gave in on most of the restrictions, and so it became more like the American Association. Anyway, but this was Gus Van der Eye, who was a tavern owner in St. Louis. And he bought the St. Louis Browns for one reason and one reason only, which is he thought it would be a very good opportunity to sell more beer. And he actually put up a beer garden in the outfield of Sportsman's Park. So he was the sort of main advocate of one view, but the very upright National League saw baseball very differently.
And this is one of these kind of through lines too,
Yes.
right? Like, is the ballpark going to be a general, kind of place of amusement?
Right.
Is it going to be a bubble of entertainment or not?
Precisely. And that remains even to this day. I've heard people say that, why it's such a travesty that Kammerer Park, the
Right,
new ballpark
right.
in Detroit, has like a merry-go-round or a Ferris wheel
Right.
and rides in the back for kids and so forth. You may or may not like it, and if you're like me, you regret that Kammerer Park was built at all because Tiger Stadium should have been kept. But
Tiger fans.
that issue notwithstanding,
Yeah.
the rides and stuff that are part of Kammerer Park is actually in the great tradition of baseball.
Yeah. Or the swimming pool in Arizona.
The swimming pool in
Many other things
Arizona,
like
which
this. Yeah,
ridiculous though it may be,
Yeah.
is just a sort of modern iteration of something that's been going on all along.
Yeah. So with the National League, they start to build some real architecture for the
Yep.
parks. And you have some splendid pictures in Ballpark of the South End grounds, home of the Boston Bean Eaters, later the Braves.
There it is, actually. Yeah.
And this was, one reporter wrote, Sir Lancelot would have felt right at home. The Boston Globe predicted that the legacy of the Boston Tea Party, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and Paul Revere's ride would all fade into nothingness in comparison to the South End grounds. Now, here in New York, we're used to a lot of free-flowing hyperbole, let's call it, from Boston fans. But this must have been some park.
Well, it was certainly the high point of the era of wooden ballparks. And it was the place in which, let's say, Victorian architecture and baseball had their finest marriage together. I mean, I've always thought if Mohonk Mountain House in New Paltz had been a ballpark, it would have looked sort of like this. Unfortunately, one problem with wooden ballparks is that they tended to catch fire. And South End grounds lasted for all of, I think, 8 years. And it burned down. It turned out to have been underinsured by the owners of the team, or the owners of the ballpark. And with their insurance settlement from the fire, they could only afford to build back a very limited version of it without the towers and without a lot of the ornate architecture. So its next iteration was much plainer than this.
Yeah, and the trouble with the fire, too, was that a Boston player named Foghorn Tucker went sliding into third base, and the Orioles' third baseman, a man known as John Muggsy McGraw, kicked him in the face, which was sort of routine behavior for McGraw and the Baltimore Orioles team he played on. And apparently, while the fire was spreading, most of the fans weren't paying attention to it, hoping to see the next part of this brawl going on. So it got out of control. And before you knew it, something like 1,900 people had lost their homes.
Yeah,
right?
well, it became an enormous fire.
Yeah,
and I think it became known in history as the Great Roxbury Fire of Boston, and destroyed much of the Roxbury neighborhood, of which South End grounds was only one part.
Yeah. So, but after this now, baseball is a big enough business that they start to rebuild in steel and stone
Exactly,
with the
yes.
Huntington grounds, later the Baker Bowl in Philadelphia, great name, but quickly progressing to the classical Palace of the Fans in Cincinnati, and the elegant and wonderfully eccentric Shibe Park.
Yes, that one we do have a picture of. You have to buy the book to see Palace of the Fans, which I must say is, especially in this age of corporate names, I mean, what could be better than calling something the Palace of the Fans? Let's see.
Yeah, the next one over here. Yeah.
There we. Nope. Sorry. For some reason, the cursor is not working very well here.
Let's see. Should we?
There we are. There's Shibe Park.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which lasted until like 1970.
1970,
Yeah.
exactly. That became Connie Mack Stadium before it was torn down entirely. But I've always, this was really the first of the truly ornate ballparks. It was not the very first steel and concrete, but one of the first, and the first that really tried to make the ballpark a grand civic building. I mean, when you see it from this side, you could think it was sort of an opera house or something like that. Go around the other side, you can see that it's an L, and the other two sides are largely open, and there's a field in the middle. But nevertheless, it was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and this is really the era, this is what you call the golden age. And
Yes.
it really is when our fields of dreams start to come up there. Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, Crosley Field in Cincinnati, Fenway Park in Boston, where earlier this week the New York Yankees eliminated the Boston Red
here
Sox
it's-
from any chance
Right,
of
right.
winning the East Division title.
Right.
Just thought I'd add.
Here is the
Yeah.
original facade of Fenway Park, which of course is still there at number 4 Jersey Street.
It really is a beautiful park and very fun. It's Tiger Stadium.
The Yankee at this moment in baseball history, the Yankees may have our hearts, but the Boston Red Sox win on the architecture front. There's no doubt about that.
And it was a very
Yeah,
weird thing, when they added, I mean, they really did a good job of kind of adding things on to make it financially viable.
Yes.
And one of the things they added on, the most money I've ever paid for a scalper's ticket, was to sit on top of the
On
Green
top of the Green
Monster.
Monster, yeah. It was a brilliant move, absolutely brilliant.
Which
move.
after seeing that my entire life,
Right.
on TV or in the park, was just weird. It was like suddenly you can get a seat on the Chrysler Building. And just sit up there on the outside of it. It was such a strange feeling, but it really works.
It's really fun, and they were very smart. I mean, we're now jumping way ahead in this story here because this was all done very recently. But the Red Sox have renovated that building with enormous buildings, that ballpark with
complex,
enormous sensitivity, and done a lot of different things to bring it up to date without destroying its basic essence. But the seats on top of the Green Monster, they realized would be such an attractive curiosity that they're the only seats in the ballpark that you cannot buy season tickets for.
Yeah.
They're only sold on a per game basis.
No, it was really. So also Tiger Stadium in Detroit and Wrigley Field in Chicago, which was originally built for no dollars in the championship. Originally built for
Very
Chicago
good, very
Whales
good, and yes, excellent.
in the Federal League.
And in the
Yeah.
short-lived Federal League,
Yeah.
and it was originally called. It was not called Wrigley Field at the beginning.
Yeah.
Wiegman Park, exactly. Wiegman Park for the
Real
owner.
baseball fans here.
Very good. And actually, I'll give you a quick trivia
Sure.
question too. Do you know what its second name was?
Between Wrigley
Right,
Field.
right,
I
Wiegman
don't know.
Park.
Was it like Cubs Field?
Yes,
or
it was
something?
actually
Okay,
called
yeah.
Cubs Field. And
Lucky guess.
when the Cubs took it over, when the Federal League failed, it was called Cubs Field. And it was only later when Wrigley got control of the team.
Yeah.
And he first, the first Wrigley Field was the minor league field that he owned in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And that was called Wrigley Field. And then 2 years later, I think about 1926 or so, he decided, that kind of nice name, Wrigley Field. Why am I not calling? Why is the Chicago one not called that too? And so that's when it became Wrigley Field.
And the LA one was quite beautiful, beautiful little minor league.
Very,
park,
it's
yeah.
actually possibly the most beautiful minor league park ever built. Yeah, and one of the few minor league parks I have in the book. It was the home for the first couple of years of the Angels.
Yeah.
And the Dodgers considered it and rejected it as too small when they moved to LA before they were ready to move into Dodger Stadium.
And to give you an idea of why the Dodgers have always been the Dodgers and the Cubs, Wrigley agreed to trade the rights for Los Angeles for the rights to move the minor league team to Fort Worth, for the Fort Worth Cats, without any other compensation, to let Walter O'Malley move into Los Angeles.
Very strange indeed.
Which was
yes.
just like,
Yeah,
this is this accounts for a lot of the 108 years of the Cubs not winning anything.
Well, Wrigley did have a very clear philosophy, which Chicago fans are happy that the current ownership does not have, but which was that he believed that if you give people a good time and make the ballpark a nice place, they care more about that than winning baseball. It was actually a pretty stupid idea, but it was not entirely and totally wrong. Yeah. And so he invested in the Ivy Walls, which were in 1937, long after the ballpark was built. They were not part of the original, and did a lot of other things to improve it, to give people a sense that this was a sort of nice place for an outing. Yeah. That was cheaper than investing in better players.
Yeah, kind of the idea that if you can't sell the ball team, sell the ballpark.
Sell the ballpark. That was exactly it. Yeah. And that was exactly what he did, with quite a lot of success in one way, because there was always extraordinary loyalty among that fan base. Yeah. He also did something else to build that loyalty, which was to make a deal for radio network broadcasting. They were the first team to have their games broadcast on a national radio network. Yeah, which gave them more stature in a way.
And which a lot of teams resisted for years because they were really afraid fans were just going to stay home.
Right, and precisely. And he actually, it's interesting, I guess it maybe came from selling chewing gum and knowing the virtues of advertising. He realized that, in fact, if you promote it, you will ultimately build a bigger audience. Yeah. And, lots of people out in the countryside who started dreaming of taking a train to Chicago and going to a Cubs game.
Yeah, and they're the same worries with TV, and that also ended up promoting it. Although there are debates, Roger Kahn kind of feels that it actually depressed attendance at first. When people could first watch it on TV, they were so fascinated by that they stayed home more, maybe.
And I know, I'm sure it had some impact. It had to, really. Yeah. Yes.
So these fields, they were made of steel and stone. They're very intimate, usually about 35,000 seats or less.
Ebbets was less than that. Yeah.
Very close to the fields. And the parks were in the city, though rarely actually in downtowns, which is interesting. The real estate was too valuable.
Right.
Right there. And even the less successful among them had their own distinctive idiosyncrasies, which is really what kind of distinguishes them as urban parks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you had Braves Field, which nobody really remembers all that well, but it had a small high bleacher section called the jury box. Griffith Stadium had a wedge out in center field where one homeowner had refused to sell.
Yeah, right. It was, I think, two homeowners, actually. So it was a big wedge, actually. Yeah. But, they were opportunistic constructions built around what you could do. The Green Monster is because of the street pattern of Boston and the nature of that site.
And of course, Ebbets Field had the hit sign windsuit for advertising Abe Stark, the haberdasher and later borough president in Brooklyn, and led to the famous New Yorker cartoon with the guy in the outfield, and behind him is a guy in a suit holding a glove here.
Right.
Stark trying to keep him from.
Right.
The 60-foot tin wall in the Baker Bowl in Philadelphia, even taller than the Green Monster.
Yes, exactly. No, the history of the early parks is filled with that, and indeed the idiosyncrasy of them is a wonderful result of responding to circumstance, but it also is intrinsic to the nature of baseball, which, as I said earlier, the playing field is not precisely the same in every place.
Right.
And it's the only sport about which that can be said.
Yeah, and probably the craziest departure was, of course, the Polo Grounds, which was, it's really too big to fit in with these other parks that had got up to 55,000 seats. but it was kind of insane in a wonderful sense. It was really a horseshoe shaped. Or
or a bathtub, if you want
shaped.
to say it. Right. And it was, unlike almost every other ballpark, it was symmetrical.
Yeah.
And of course, center field was far, far deeper than right and left. Yeah.
And you had, in the deepest center, you had the clubhouses and the team offices.
Right.
Like way far out there. So just kind of nuts, but it made for some of the great moments. I mean, Willie Mays' catch.
The great catch, yes,
He's so
exactly.
far out there.
Exactly. Yep.
Thompson's home run into the short left field. And kind of just like a natural place to take a bow for players after the game out in the clubhouse, which they did too. So there's just all of these, in Ebbets Field, of course, with the chain link fence and the scoreboard out there. But another distinguishing feature from the golden era was that they were, you could see the city from them, these parks, and the city can see into them.
Yes,
That you actually-
totally, absolutely. There was a sense that they were part of the urban fabric in every way, and as you point out, it kind of went both ways. That you could look in. It's not just Wrigley with the famous rooftop seats, which are probably the legendary example of that, but there's some great photographs of Shibe Park and townhouses across the street and people watching the game from that. But the glimpse from the IRT into Yankee Stadium is actually very much the same thing. I mean, the idea that the ballpark is woven into the urban fabric is, I think, also very much part of the history of baseball. And because that urban fabric is a little bit different everywhere, that's meaningful. But, it's not only is it a literal visibility, we might say, it's also a sense of it being part of a community. In the glory days of the Dodgers in Ebbets Field, a lot of the team lived in that part of Brooklyn.
Right.
It was all a neighborhood. And while obviously the Dodgers were much, much, much more than just a neighborhood baseball team, nevertheless, the fact that a lot of them lived there, and the team's offices were in Brooklyn, and everything was tied together with the identity of Brooklyn as well as that part of Brooklyn, was a fantastic thing.
Yeah, it's almost you almost ended up revering the players more, although they were more accessible. Like Mickey Mantle used to apparently walk from his hotel to Yankee Stadium every day, and like the 50s, there must have been like seeing a hill god emerge. As opposed to
this is
remote.
actually jumping to Detroit. Two views of Tiger Stadium, or Navin Field as it was originally, and again that sense of it. I think you see the sense of connection to the urban fabric more clearly there than anywhere. And then, of course, here is Ebbets, where you also feel it very profoundly. Yeah, I think.
And as you write about, so with Yankee Stadium, originally they're going to make it just kind of monumental to really take full advantage of having Babe Ruth there. No team draws 1 million fans until Ruth comes to the Yankees. By the way, where did the Yankees start life in?
Very good.
But before the Polo Grounds, Washington Heights, Hilltop Park, where the
they were the Highlanders.
Where Columbia
They were the New York Highlanders. Yes, and I understand. Although I failed in my research for this book to take the time to go confirm this myself, but I understand that there is somewhere in the middle of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, there is a little plaque that shows the exact location of home plate. Yes.
And how they must have totally regraded it, because it's sort of on a hillside, or maybe not. It sounds like an insane park for the most part.
Yeah.
But they were initially considering building a stadium to hold 100,000 fans, and as you write, had Yankee Stadium been built according to its original fully enclosed design, it would have been a far different place, less connected to the classic ballparks out of which it came than prefiguring the fully enclosed mega stadiums of the mid-20th century, like the Astrodome. And instead, they have a park, you can kind of see the Lexington Avenue line, you see a lot of the Bronx.
Right.
And you write that it was offering just enough sense of movement and activity to be enlivening from within the ballpark, but never so much as to be distracting from play. And I think that's completely right.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's really critical for a great ballpark. It should not be fully enclosed on all sides. And, Yankee Stadium was conceived with the idea that it would be bigger, grander, more monumental than any ballpark up to that point. It was indeed the first one that was called stadium rather than ballpark or field. The ownership of the team, I guess, thought that this was all part and parcel of that, this enclosure. What is not clear is whether they had second thoughts for philosophical reasons or whether they decided they simply couldn't sell enough tickets to fill 100,000 seats, or whether they just didn't want to spend that much money. Yeah. But in any case, they built a somewhat smaller version that was still bigger than any other ballpark in existence, but smaller than the first version of the design. But we're very lucky that, well, we're not lucky it's gone anyway, but we were very lucky that it was not built that way, because there's another almost more philosophical point to be made about this, which is that in baseball, I spoke earlier about indefinite dimensions, and just as the game is played in indefinite time and not against a clock, it also is played in indefinite space, and the sense that space goes on, even if of course there are bleachers, of course there are fences, it doesn't literally be open, but when you have nothing but low bleachers in the outfield and the grandstands do not wrap around and entirely enclose it, you can feel the space going on, as well as you pointed out, see in and feel a connection. All those things are possible. The minute you enclose the whole thing, it becomes just a gargantuan arena, which takes away something very critical to the nature of baseball.
And which is really what started happening after the war.
Yes.
When they start, no longer are the stadiums financed by individual team owners. Right. They're now financed by cities, and cities really have a financial interest in making them multi-purpose.
Yes, it was a combination. Yeah, absolutely right. It was a combination of things happened in after World War II. It was kind of a perfect storm, if I can say that, of factors. Municipal financing and the desire to get the most out of it, which meant multi-purpose stadiums. The rise of football, which grew in the post-war years very much as a result of television, I think, into a significant professional sport, which it had not been before, and the whole movement to the suburbs. Yeah. Those things kind of all reinforced each other to bring us to what I call in the book, the era of the concrete donuts. Yes. Yeah. And of which, our prime example here in New York, of course, was Shea Stadium. Right. Although, thankfully, Shea, too, was better than many of the others because it never went all the way around. Right. Some of them were complete cylinders, completely enclosed. Shea, at least, again, it had that kind of, it was a modified horseshoe. Yeah.
Yeah, and these parks, they had, artificial turf a lot of times. Kind of nobody really liked them all that much for anything, but particularly not for baseball. And they also start to move out to the suburbs because of parking. Yeah.
Yes, very, very, very much so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, here's some of that.
Let's see, we can jump ahead to, let's see, which ones do we have here? Here, for example. Yeah. I mean, this is I think that's Shea, actually.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, that's Shea.
Because it's at least a little open.
Yeah. And the pure circle, which I think was, again, part of a kind of post-war tendency to favor simplistic geometries. You were no longer worrying about the street pattern and funny shapes. It seemed to people who didn't know better, I guess, to be equally suitable for baseball and football. What a pure circle actually is equally unsuitable for both baseball and football because it did not really serve either one of them that well.
And this kind of gets involved with the whole reason, and I dread touching on it in some ways because we could be here. It's been something New Yorkers have been debating for 60 years, and we could be here for another 60 years talking about it. But this gets involved with why the Dodgers leave Brooklyn.
Why the Dodgers left. Yeah. Well, which I must say, it was one of the most fascinating things to research in the process of writing this book, because it's a much more interesting and complicated story than I had understood before. What became very clear, and I'm going to say this with hesitation because I do not want to suggest that I'm trying to elevate the reputation of Walter O'Malley too much. Nevertheless, what was clear was that he did not so much hate Brooklyn as hate Ebbets Field. Yeah. And he believed it was dirty, messy, awkward, small, uncomfortable, and impossible to renovate or improve. And that it had not only no parking, but no way to add much parking, no way to give it anything it needed, or he felt it needed. And to be fair to poor old Mr. O'Malley, not so poor old Mr. O'Malley,
rich old
Mr. O'Malley, this was the 50s,
right,
when this whole notion of the suburbs and the automobile, it all seemed fresh and new and cool and liberating. Nobody fully understood how all that stuff could turn, how the car, this act of liberation, could in fact be something that would destroy the cities and strangle the suburbs and do all these other bad things. Yeah. And nobody saw what was coming to the cities at that point. Yeah. And we also had a very, very diminished consciousness of the value of historic buildings.
Yeah.
Remember, it was, Ebbets Field went before Penn Station. I mean, we were really not saving much of anything in those days. And O'Malley kind of understood that you needed to give fans, particularly in the age of television, a different kind of experience if they were going to get out of their sofas and come to a ballpark. And so he tried very hard for a while to build something else in Brooklyn. Yeah. And in fact, here are two different versions of ballparks that he commissioned. One, believe it or not, from Norman Bell Geddes, a great mid-century modern designer who is probably best known, by the way, about whom there was a fantastic exhibition in this museum a couple years ago. You cannot go upstairs and see it because it's gone, but it was really wonderful. And Bell Geddes is probably best known for having designed the Futurama at the New York World's Fair in 1939, which was also similarly a kind of visionary, wonderful, Panglossian view of what the automobile was going to bring us. And he envisioned this domed stadium combined with a shopping mall, underground parking, a multiplex theater, sort of everything the 50s thought was going to be very cool. And then another version was done by Buckminster Fuller, even more interesting, actually. O'Malley wanted to build these in downtown Brooklyn, more or less where Barclays Center now is, actually. Yeah. They did not come to be for many reasons. The most significant of one is that a certain gentleman by the name of Mr. Moses had some say over redevelopment projects in New York. O'Malley wanted him to provide public support for assembling the land, although he was willing to pay to build the building itself. Moses did not like O'Malley. He did not like Brooklyn particularly. And I think most of all, he did not really like baseball. And most of all, he did not like projects that he did not initiate and control. And so What he did do was say to O'Malley, if you really want my help, come this way. I'll show you a little place where I can give you the land. It was called Flushing Meadow. And he offered the Dodgers the site where ultimately, years later, of course, Shea Stadium would be built. And O'Malley allegedly said to him, Mr. Moses, doesn't matter if you take the Dodgers 3 miles or 3,000 miles out of Brooklyn, they're no longer the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he would not leave Brooklyn, and so ultimately made the deal for Los Angeles. And there, one of the first things he did as they were beginning to plan Dodger Stadium was send his management team to Disneyland, of all places, which at that point was only 5 years old or something. And he said, this is how, in the modern age, you should treat customers. And he envisioned this sleek, modern, polite, clean place that would be the antithesis of what, for him, was the grungy mess of Ebbets Field. Obviously, today, we see this in a more nuanced way than that, and we can see how much was lost when Ebbets Field was lost. But, you know, in a weird way, I can kind of see within the limits of 1950s thinking how his brain was working on all this stuff.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Although, you know, and the one point, though, in looking over this whole dispute over it, I mean, first of all, the amount of money he wanted spent on it was something that cities didn't really spend in those days, even to assemble the land. But also, he felt New York could do it with Title I funds, which Moses was doing a lot of horrific things with, such as the Coliseum, one of the ugliest buildings ever built in New York. But that, you know, the Title I funds were federal funds, which enabled you're supposed to build housing with it, but you could build some community things, such as maybe a ballpark. But it would have meant tearing down something like 110 blocks of like brownstone Brooklyn, which would have been, you know, just kind of
well, they were. I mean, they looked at multiple sites at different times. Right. But right. To justify the money and to actually do it as a Title I project, yes. And you know, in the end, we're also lucky it didn't happen. In that, I think, intriguing as these were, they are most valuable, I think, to us now as a reminder that O'Malley did try very hard in his own way to stay before he left. We're lucky they weren't built because, in fact, the Belgetti's thing was essentially a proto-Astrodome, a dozen years before the Astrodome. It's hard to imagine anything more unsuited to the urban fabric of Brooklyn than the Astrodome dropped in the middle of it. So, you know, I think we would actually be despising it if it had been built. I mean, the Astrodome is bad enough in the middle of a Houston sprawl. In the middle of Brooklyn, it would have been horrendous. So it's all just as well in the end.
Yeah, and it's Moses says it would be a Chinese wall in the middle of Brooklyn. And he's kind of right. I mean, blocking it off with this huge thing and bringing all this traffic to it would have just stopped up.
Exactly. If Moses thought it would be all too much, imagine. Right.
It is kind of an odd reversal, you know.
Totally, absolutely. But it's a fascinating, weird little piece of history.
And he's, you know, the thing O'Malley's basing this on is because the Braves have moved to Milwaukee, this kind of classic smaller city that he thought was kind of the future. And he's saying, boy, they have 53,000 seats and 12,000 parking spots. Ebbets Field had 750 parking spots. And it said, like, they're going to outpark us 15-1. It would only be a question of 2, 3, or 5 years before Milwaukee would be the Yankees of the National League and Brooklyn would be the Washington Senators. And, you know, within, like, 12 years, the Braves have moved on to Atlanta. And
right. Parking is not, in fact, everything. Right.
So after this terrible period, though, of the suburban parks.
Well, we should just for a second
whatever you want.
stay with the Dodgers. only because, and look at what they did build, of course, which is Dodger Stadium, which amazingly is actually now the third oldest ballpark in the major leagues,
Yeah.
which is incredible to think. Because some of us still think of it as, well, you know, it was 1962 as a modern ballpark. But everything built in between Wrigley Field in 1914 and Dodger Stadium is now gone. So it's the third oldest ballpark in use. It's a funny thing because it is entirely automobile dependent, and even though it's close to downtown, as you can see, an absolute nightmare to get into and get out of. But once you're actually finally in it and in your seat, it's one of the loveliest places in America to watch a baseball game.
Oh, absolutely.
And O'Malley, again, to give him a little bit of credit where it's due, because we are being properly critical where that's due too, I think he at least understood that it should be a baseball-only ballpark and would have none of this multi-purpose nonsense. And so at a time when almost everything was a round structure intended to serve football and baseball, Dodger Stadium is actually almost alone. The only other thing from its era was Kansas City that was built for baseball only. Everything else in that era was built to serve football as well as baseball. Some of them actually even favored football. But Dodger Stadium is baseball only, and it remains an absolutely wonderful ballpark if you leave in the seventh inning.
Yeah, which much of the fan base
Just
is
about everybody does to
famous
beat the
for
traffic.
doing.
Right.
Yeah, that's a term. So, you have these horrible parks that nobody
Right.
likes really. Although, weirdly, that's when people start going back to ball games, maybe out of nostalgia for the old parks.
Right. Some.
And then you have these retro parks built. They're going to build one maybe in Chicago that's a very interesting looking thing to replace Comiskey. But the White Sox, as you write about, say, no thanks.
Right.
And instead they go to Camden Yards in Baltimore, and it's the first of the
Well,
throwback
the White
parks.
Sox built what we might call the last of the concrete donuts.
Yeah.
In effect, yes. It was opened in 1991, by which time we knew better, but nevertheless, it happened anyway. It's another long, complicated, sad story. It now has the unfortunate name of Guaranteed Rate Field. But, next year we'll have another name, I'm sure, so it's okay. I might say parenthetically that this whole business of corporate naming.
Oh, horrible.
Two ballparks changed their names this season as we were going to press with this book. Seattle, which went from Safeco Field to T-Mobile rather, and San Francisco, which went from AT&T Park to Oracle Park. And these were announced around Christmas, and we had to go through the proofs of the book and run through and go changing it all the way through. Where was I on that?
Talking about the naming rights.
Exactly.
And you're saying in Chicago.
Right. Chicago Guaranteed Rate Field, exactly.
Yeah.
But so the White Sox tried to move to the suburbs.
Yeah.
The city was actually the state and city was so desperate to keep them because they also almost moved to St. Petersburg.
Right.
Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg was built without a team in the hopes that it would attract a team to move there, and the White Sox were sort of number one on their list of potential tenants and came very close to doing it. And the state of Illinois freaked out and basically said, "You've got to. We'll give you anything to stay." Yeah. And they did, but they built a truly terrible ballpark. They also went through a brief period of romancing the suburbs and almost built in Aurora outside of Chicago. which is kind of the equivalent of as if the Yankees had moved to the Meadowlands, which they, of course,
Which
as
they
you know,
considered
considered
for a while,
at one
yeah.
point. Right. That did not happen in large part because the citizens of Aurora voted it down
Wow,
to their
yeah.
endless,
Yeah.
enduring credit.
Yes.
Yes, and so when when Illinois convinced them to say no to St. Petersburg, the deal was to go back to the south side of Chicago where they'd always been.
And that's sort of the other side of it's great, we have much better ballparks now, but an amazing amount of public money being spent. For instance, in this city, the Yankees get a new stadium, the Mets get a new stadium, and their minor league teams get new stadiums. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars of expenditures in a city which claims it, or a state which claims it doesn't have the money to rebuild the subway system.
Right.
Incredible amounts spent in places like Detroit and Cleveland, really suffering industrial cities. And they're building, they build a football park, a baseball park. There are demands for separate soccer parks to be built, a basketball arena, a hockey arena. It seems kind of out of control now,
Yeah, there's been a beginnings of a backlash. We'll see how far it goes. I do know that in a couple of cases recently, we've seen ownerships of teams shoulder somewhat more of the cost, including much of the cost of the actual structure. But of course, while they love to point to that, usually that's done in conjunction with the city providing them the land free, building parking garages, doing a whole bunch of other things along with it, so that while the team may be spending a fair amount of money, the taxpayers are hardly off the hook. They're still spending plenty as well. It's a very complicated and difficult issue, and it is one thing that I will say, for all you can say about it, is not unique to baseball.
Right.
Because if anything, the NFL is probably an even worse offender in this, holding cities up for even more money, because football stadiums are even bigger.
Yeah.
And so therefore they're holding up even more. But which doesn't make it right. It just means that, and every city's story is a little bit different. None of them are entirely justifiable. I'm not saying it. But for example, in New York, the whole thing emerged ultimately out of the whole long, complicated dance about the Olympics.
Yes.
And whether New York would make it a serious bid for the Olympics. Bloomberg had been opposed to municipal financing of stadiums. But then, when he supported the Olympics bid, of which the proposal for a Jets stadium on the far west side in what's now Hudson Yards was a key part, because that would have been the main Olympics stadium. When that fell apart because of the objections of Shelley Silver in Albany, they scrambled to figure out how to keep the Olympics bid alive.
Right.
And the only thing they could think of that they could throw together quickly, because this was all within, I think, a couple of months before the formal presentations to the Olympics Committee, was to build a new stadium on empty land next to Shea. Yeah. And the deal was, okay, Mets, you go along with us on this, you'll get a new ballpark out of this, if we can use it for the Olympics for a year. And so Fred Wilpon, of course, says sure. Once that's said, the Yankees have to say me too, and Bloomberg cannot say no. And so Bloomberg, who was actually an opponent of municipal financing, due to the Olympics, backed himself into a corner and had to finance both new ballparks. Of course, by the time those things got going, the Olympics bid had failed, and the 2012 Olympics went to London. So it's the law of unintended consequences comes into play at every step of this. My great disappointment in that whole elaborate charade is that we did not build either of the two new ballparks in what I think would have been the best location for it, for one of them, which in fact was Hudson Yards, which would have been a terrible place for a football stadium.
Right.
Because a football stadium is generally, somewhere between 50 and 75% bigger in its footprint and number of seats, and is used only 8 times a year. So there's nothing worse in a city than having this gargantuan thing sitting in the middle of it empty. And the culture of football also has tailgating along with it, which means parking lots and all that stuff. But a baseball park is very, very different. I mean, as we've been saying all evening, baseball fits into a city. Baseball works wonderfully in a city, and the scale is more modest. It's used much more often. You could have put a ballpark in a corner of Hudson Yards and still had plenty of room left over for condos, if that's what you really want, and shopping malls and all the other stuff that's there.
That kind of monstrous.
Right, exactly. One could have just had a little less of it and had a ballpark. And it certainly would have also preempted the accusations that are made quite justifiably about Hudson Yards that it's a kind of enclave for the rich. I mean, if you had a ballpark in the corner of it, everybody would have been going there.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's a great sadness. The other site I would have loved to have seen, other than Flushing Meadow, would have been Long Island City, which was already beginning to densify and urbanize, although not to the extent it has since then. And, that would have still, if they wanted to stay in Queens, it would have still been in Queens. You have lots of mass transit. You have so many options there. I think it would have been a wonderful place for a ballpark.
I think that's really the I worry that the Hudson Yards Park would have brought traffic to an absolute standstill, along with Broadway, there and everything else. But I think you're right about Long Island City. That would have been just a beautiful place to build a park, and you could have left the park formerly known as Shea to football, and had expanded, and put a nice ballpark right in the East River there. That would have been a great idea.
So. It would have been wonderful. And it's very sad because it really was a missed chance. We will not do it again in our time.
Yeah.
I think Citi Field is perfectly decent, and I like it vastly more than I like Shea.
Right.
But it's kind of an urban ballpark in search of an urban setting.
I think that's very true.
It's right out. It's still just sitting out there in a sea of parking.
Well, I think the first time I went there, they still had part of Shea up, and I thought, oh, this is lovely. There's a whole neighborhood. And I thought, wait a minute, there's no
neighborhood.
And then they tore it down.
Right,
and it was,
right.
So, questions, comments, criticisms, and no criticisms. But anyway, who's? Let's see. I think this gentleman was first here. Wait for the mic there, please.
Oh,
thank you.
Just following up on the new Yankee Stadium.
Sure, which we have not yet talked about.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Well, is this a good distance to hold the mic?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
In 2008, they had the Olympics with a couple of very modern and striking stadiums with the Cube and the Bird's Nest athletic field. And then the next year, they opened up 2 very obvious throwbacks to early 20th century stadiums in New York City. Do you think something unique about baseball or something unique about American culture that whoever designed those was going in such a different non-21st century direction as opposed to what they were trying to do in Beijing with the Olympics?
No, it's a great question. There's been a tension. First, one thing we didn't really talk about, and somehow entirely by accident, this little group of slides does not include Camden Yards, which it should have. Which probably in the book, I should tell you, gets probably more attention than any other single ballpark, because it really is the great turning point, and after it, nothing was the same again. And so it was entirely by mistake that it's not included here. But what Camden Yards did was, in one fell swoop, bring the era of the concrete donut to a close. It reasserted baseball only. It reasserted kind of eccentricity and idiosyncrasy and the keeping of the old warehouse, of course, connected it to the urban fabric. It was connected to the urban fabric in many other ways as well. And I think because nothing like that had been done, and there was before, at least not at the scale of a major league ballpark yet, and there was a great deal of anxiety about sort of returning to the roots of baseball. The building, as a piece of architecture, is a little more retro than it might have needed to be, and some people would have wanted. It's still wonderful and absolutely without question the most influential ballpark of modern times, because it changed everything. In my book, I actually quote George Will as saying, there are three completely path-breaking events that redefined baseball in the post-World War II era. The first was Jackie Robinson and the integration of the major leagues. The second was free agency. And the third was Camden Yards. It's an interesting trio, and I think he's completely right. In any case, that sort of set a pattern of somewhat retro-looking buildings, even though Camden Yards, one of the reasons it's so good as it is how beautifully it integrates a sort of traditional baseball feeling and a sense of intimacy with modern amenities. I mean, there's plenty of toilets, unlike old Ballpark. There's plenty of places to eat. It's got all that sort of stuff. Anyway, the architects of Camden Yards, which was then the firm called HOK Sport, they've changed the name since, it's now Populous, were always they were proud of it, but they were a little ambivalent about the sort of traditional aspect of it. And their next commission was Jacobs Field, now Progressive Field in Cleveland, where they actually tried very hard to sort of make it feel a little bit more modern, actually. And since then, there's been a kind of interplay back and forth of, with a general kind of layout like Camden Yards, how modern can you be while still trying to make it sort of entertaining and seem to connect in some way to the traditions of baseball without being too cute and theme parky, which nobody wants to do either. And so, when the first two ballparks to follow Camden Yards were Cleveland, by the same architect, which is a little bit more modern looking, intentionally, and what's now Globe Life. It was then called the Ballpark at Arlington for the Texas Rangers, for which they hired an architect named David Schwartz, who had never done a ballpark before, whose entire practice was based on very traditional architecture. And he built a building that was so old-fashioned in its external appearance that it almost makes Camden Yards look modern. So you could see these two directions going. Since then we've had the Marlins in Miami, which is probably the most overtly modern-looking stadium in Major League Baseball. It's white, it's sleek, it's got lots of glass. I'm not in love with it, partly because it's another retractable roof stadium, and I inherently don't like ballparks with roofs, even though I concede that, if you are at an afternoon game in Miami in August, I can understand the appeal of it. But it's a very self-consciously modern building based on this same kind of formula. So we've seen these two parallel streams, really, going on. You're right to go, but none of them, however, including Miami, is the kind of radical piece of high modern architecture that we saw in Beijing in 2008, as you point out. But it is interesting that in New York, the leaning was more retro. It's also very interesting to me that they're so different from each other. Citi Field is a self-conscious and I think kind of clunky attempt to evoke Ebbets Field. It's a nice place when you're in it, but it's not terribly convincing. The Ebbets Field aspect is the weakest and least convincing part of it, and the silliest, actually. And then Yankee Stadium, which is kind of a parody of the kind of pompous, self-conscious monumentality of the old one. On the other hand, it's still a better place to watch a ball game than the prior incarnation, because everything wonderful about Yankee Stadium in its original iteration was destroyed in the truly unspeakable 1970s renovation. At which point, I mean, they destroyed that building and claimed credit for saving it, which is the ultimate hypocrisy. So, but since it was already gone, my feeling was we might as well start all over again. And the new one is better than the middle one, but not nearly as good as the original.
Yeah, I would say quickly, just like from a user's point of view, the upper level on Yankee Stadium, where I have almost always sat, is a lot nicer place to see a game now, being open, not being nearly as cramped and dirty and actually dangerous at times.
Right.
I like the fact that it's near the Plaza Apartments, this wonderful old Art Deco apartment there. I'm not sure how much the people in the Plaza Apartments like it. I think what was horribly botched were things like the big restaurant out in center field, which actually blocks the sight lines of some of the fans in the bleachers to the point where you have to put video screens in the walls, which is horrendous. And of course, the usual thing of kind of creating these other places for fans to go on various levels of elite little places, maybe the most ridiculous of which, this is in many parks now, the Jim Beam Lounge, where you can go and sit in the Jim Beam Lounge and not face the park, but I guess watch the game on TV, to which my solution is sit at home, drink some Jim Beam, and avoid the huge amount of money spent on tickets, food, and the inevitable car crash on your way home. So, certain things about it work. I think the one thing to be said for all the Yankee stadiums, at least they kept it in the Bronx, which I think.
Well, and while the Yankees are not exact, I mean, it's definitely as aggressive a business as ever existed in ballpark, in baseball. But thankfully, the one thing they have not tried to sell is the name.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the only thing they have not tried to sell, I would say, actually. But they did not try. Now, but even that, of course, lest we think of this as some great act of altruism and nobility, I would not be at all surprised if their marketing people simply said to them, this is the most famous sports venue in the world, and no name anyone would buy would be worth as much as this.
I suspect you're right.
And therefore, don't even try.
I suspect you're right. Although I do feel it's kind of horrible to have Citi Field named for one of the all-time financial predators of our history, which has brought down the American economy again and again.
Yes, but it could be worse. I mean, in Houston, remember when the Astros moved from the Astrodome, they moved initially to what was called Enron Field. That came only a year before Enron had that spectacular collapse and scandal. Yeah. And it's the only time, by the way, that a team has had to buy back naming rights because they no longer wanted it to be called Enron Field. Yeah. It was too embarrassing. But Enron felt it was exactly the opposite. It was the only positive association their name had. And so they actually said to the Astros, no, we have a 20-year contract or whatever it was, and we're not budging. And the Astros had to pay them to effectively ransom it back to get the name back, at which point they then promptly went and sold it to Minute Maid. But
Well, we're close to out of time here. Maybe like one more question or yeah. Yes, sir.
Speaking of ballpark peculiarities or idiosyncrasies, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Crosley Field, but I do. And there was actually a ramp in deep center field. The field went uphill.
Yes.
Was there any possible engineering reason for that, or?
I don't think so. I mean, I know you're right, and I think it's referred to in the book. I don't recall. I think it's just the way it was, kind of, actually, which is, again, a wonderful part of baseball history because so much of it was circumstance and happenstance and all of that.
And I mean, it was a good 10 feet or so. I don't know how long, but I mean, you could see actually the fielder having to,
To run uphill.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's true.
To just a quick thing on the idiosyncrasies.
Yeah. Houston, right.
They had the 60-foot tin wall in the Baker Bowl in Philadelphia. Very typical. All these places like this led to stories. At one point, the Dodgers were playing there, managed at the time by Casey Stengel, and the right fielder was Hack Wilson for that year. And he had been out late the night before, getting liquored up, as ball players tended to do in the time. And there was a pitcher giving up hit after hit, a guy named, appropriately, Boom Boom Beck. And so Stengel came out to get him. Hack Wilson decided to kind of squat down and take a little nap out in right field while this was going on. Beck, who felt he should have been left in, turned around and hurled the ball toward the big tin wall and right. It bounced off it. Wilson, waking up, figured he had fallen asleep while play had resumed. So he instantly turned, whirled, got the ball, and threw it into second. And Stengel said it was the best throw he had made all year.
Well, we can do one more. Sure. Yeah.
Just to the Citi Field and Enron thing.
Yeah.
I just when the question was what Citi Field would be named. This is such a knowledgeable group. Most people here probably even know why it was called Shea Stadium, but that's another story.
Right.
But when there was a question of when it was going to be named, I just want to tell you, because you brought up that it's going to sort of be like Ebbets Field, sort of, and about Enron, there was a radio segment inviting listeners to call in what to call it. And some brilliant wag, because Citibank at that point was clearly in mammoth debt.
Right.
And some brilliant guy called in and said, call it Ebbets Field.
Ebbets Field, right. Well, given that the Wilpons lost a great deal of money with Bernie Madoff, that would have been appropriate anyway, I think, going forward. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Do you have time
Great.
for one more here?
Yeah, okay.
All right,
Yeah.
sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I can do without the mic. My question for you just about the Negro Leagues, how they fit into the story.
Mm-hmm.
They play in the Major League ballparks, they play in their own ballparks.
Usually, yeah. They were a source of income, usually, which was a big reason why the owners were very reluctant to let black ball players into the leagues, because a lot of time they made, for instance, the Homestead Grays, who were supposedly out of Homestead, Pennsylvania, but they played most of their games in Griffith Stadium in Washington. And that was a big source of revenue to Clark Griffith, who had this awful Senators team. You'd have these guys come in and play, when the team wasn't there. There were a few, though. The guy who owned the Cuban Stars, Alexander Pompez, built his own little park in Upper Manhattan. And the owner of the Pittsburgh Crawfords did, too.
Yeah, there were a few of them. And actually, Hinchcliffe Stadium in Paterson, New Jersey, was a Negro League stadium. And there were several of them, but there were also many instances, particularly in major markets, where they were tenants of major league teams. I mean, that's an extraordinary and important story. It's one that I don't tell in this book only because it deserves its own. Really, it's its own story, but it's a very important one, and it does kind of weave in and out of the edges of the bigger story of the story. Yes.
Pompous was like a lot of the Negro League owners, was a numbers baron and made his money that way, but loved baseball and got these great Latin players and black players and had this park up there. And he was kind of under the thumb of Dutch Schultz. And one day, Thomas Dewey's investigators came and said, "You're going to testify for us against Dutch Schultz." And Dutch Schultz's boy showed up and said, "No, you're not." And so he did the only logical thing, which was to flee to Mexico. And by the time he got back several years later, Dutch Schultz was dead, but his park had been made into a parking lot for a public housing complex up in Upper Manhattan. So the Cuban Stars became the only Negro League team to then be a minor league team of a major league franchise, the Giants, while they were still in the Polo Grounds.
And the Polo Grounds is housing, and Ebbets Field is a housing complex. Right.
People know how the Polo Grounds got their name? It was actual Polo Grounds.
But not that actual place. Right. The prior home of the Giants was, in fact, a Polo Grounds, and the name was so attached to the team that it traveled with them to this bigger, more elaborate new ballpark. But in fact, actually, we do have a picture of this. John Brush, who owned the team for a period, actually tried to call it Brush Stadium. And there was a brief period, I think just a year or two after it opened in its current iteration in 1911, when that was the official name, but nobody ever called it that. It was kind of like, I guess, the baseball equivalent of Avenue of the Americas or something like that, actually. And so, but the Polo Grounds was 6th Avenue, so it was they, within a year or two, threw in the towel, and Brush Stadium just kind of disappeared as a name. But if it ever was even used, other than in that printed program.
Yeah, and the original park had been in Manhattan around 110th Street.
Right.
It had been owned by James Gordon Bennett, the son of the newspaper magnate,
Right.
who was engaged to a woman very high in New York society. He got completely drunk one night, came to her party, and urinated in the fireplace, which even by the standards of New York society at the time was too much.
But not by the standards of baseball,
right.
perhaps.
He would have been right. He had to flee to Europe for the rest of his life, and hence the Giants got to have a park.
Right.
And on that note, I think we should wrap it up. Huge round of applause.